Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at how female characters are represented on TV.
Ooh, sounds interesting.
Yeah, and to make things even more interesting, we're going to be comparing two shows from very different eras.
Okay, I'm intrigued. I love a
Yeah.
good comparison. What shows are we talking about?
So we're going to be taking a look at I Dream of Jeannie from way back in the 1960s.
Oh, wow, a classic.
Yeah, and then we'll jump ahead a few decades and check out Veronica Mars from the early 2000s.
Okay, so like a classic sitcom versus like a teen mystery drama.
Exactly. And we've got this awesome academic paper that actually compares these two shows.
Okay, so what makes these two shows so special for this like comparison thing?
Well, the paper argues that they kind of represent like a major shift in how women were portrayed on TV, over those like 40 years or so.
I can already see where this is doing, like different social norms and all that.
Right. And the paper gets into some really cool theories about like magic and mystery and how those genres tie into the whole thing.
Okay, I'm definitely hooked. So how are we going to tackle this?
Well, first, I think we should give everyone a quick like refresher on each show just in case they haven't seen them in a while.
Yeah, good idea. I mean, it's been a minute since I've seen either of them.
Okay, so I Dream of Jeannie, as you might guess, is about this genie named Jeannie.
Right, and she's like stuck in a bottle or something?
Yeah, she's found by this astronaut named Tony Nelson, and he like becomes her master.
Okay, so right away, we've got this interesting power dynamic going on.
Right, she's got all this incredible magic. She can like grant wishes and do pretty much anything, but she's bound to serve him.
That's definitely a reflection of those times.
Totally. And now let's fast forward to Veronica Mars. She's this high school student who moonlights as a private investigator.
Whoa. Okay, that's a very different vibe.
Right. She's solving crimes, dealing with all this dark stuff, and like totally defying authority.
It's like the complete opposite of Jeannie just fulfilling her master's every whim.
Exactly. And that's what this paper really gets into, this like total shift in how these two characters approach the world, and especially like how they interact with men.
Okay, I can see that Jeannie is very much in this like subservient role.
Totally. Like she's constantly catering to Tony, even choosing to stay with him when she could be like totally free.
And Veronica, on the other hand, she's like fiercely independent.
Right. She's not afraid to call men out, even humiliate them when they deserve it.
It's almost like you can feel those decades of changing social norms between these two characters.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of encoding and decoding comes in.
Oh yeah, Stuart Hall's theory.
Yeah, have you ever heard of it?
Yeah, basically it's about how the creators of a show encode certain messages based on the social norms of their time.
Right, but then the audience decodes those messages through their own experiences and like the norms of their time.
Exactly. So like Jeannie's subservience, which might have seemed normal to audiences in the 60s, could feel totally outdated or even problematic to someone watching it today.
It's like the meaning of the show can change over time depending on who's watching and when.
And that's a super important thing to keep in mind as we like dive deeper into these shows.
Okay, now one thing that kind of jumped out at me when I was reading this paper was that both characters, while they're so different personality-wise, are still like white attractive and blonde.
Yeah, you're right. Good point.
Does that like play into how they're perceived even with all these other changes going on?
Absolutely. And this is where Richard Dyer's work on whiteness becomes really relevant.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that. Can you break it down for us?
Yeah, so Dyer argues that even when you have like a so-called deviant character, like a genie or a teenage private investigator, they can still reinforce dominant norms if they fit into certain like racial categories.
So even though Jeannie's this magical being and Veronica's like breaking all these rules, they're still operating within this framework of whiteness being like the norm.
Exactly. It raises some important questions about like who gets to be seen as the hero and whose stories are considered the default.
Right? It's not just about individual characters, but like the bigger picture of representation.
Okay, so we've got these two characters, both products of their times, both considered heroines in their own way, but how they actually achieve that hero status is totally different.
Totally. Like Jeannie uses her magic to solve problems and often rescue Tony from these like silly situations.
Right, her heroism is tied to her magical abilities, but it's always like in the service of a man.
And then you've got Veronica, who's out there fighting for justice, often protecting those who are vulnerable.
So it's like magic versus action fantasy versus reality.
And both shows use their genres in interesting ways to explore these themes, like I Dream of Jeannie uses magic to drive the plot and create humor.
And Veronica Mars uses mystery to delve into these like darker, more realistic issues.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork now. Let's really get into the nitty-gritty of how these shows portray women and how those portrayals have evolved over time.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Okay, so we've been talking about like how these two shows, I Dream of Jeannie and Veronica Mars, how they reflect these like changing ideas about women on TV.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about something the paper mentioned.
Okay.
It said that Jeannie actually wants to be Tony's wife.
Oh, yeah.
I always kind of thought of her more as like this mischievous sidekick.
Yeah, it's easy to overlook that little detail, but I think that desire to be his wife speaks volumes about like the expectations placed on women back then.
Right, even fictional women with magical powers.
Exactly. It's like even though she can literally alter reality, she's still drawn to fitting into this like traditional role.
It's almost like those societal norms were so like ingrained that they crossed over into the fantastical realm,
Right.
It makes you wonder how much those messages were influencing viewers.
Absolutely. And it makes Veronica's independence even more striking in contrast. Like she's not seeking a husband, she's seeking justice.
Right, and her relationships with men totally reflect that.
Yeah. Yeah, she challenges them. She outsmarts them. She's not defined by her romantic attachments.
And she's not afraid to call them out on their bad behavior either.
Right.
Remember that scene where she confronts her ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend?
Yeah.
And like totally humiliates her.
Yeah.
It's brutal, but you can't help but admire her for like refusing to be walked all over.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
not just about romantic relationships. It's about Veronica's agency and autonomy.
Yeah.
She's in control of her own narrative.
Okay, so we've talked about how these characters relate to men, but what about their relationships with other women?
Yeah, that's a crucial part of this conversation too, and often overlooked.
Right.
And I think this is where we see another like stark contrast between Jeannie and Veronica.
Okay, how so?
But Jeannie's interactions with other women are often very limited and kind of superficial. She's almost like isolated in this world of men, which further emphasizes her dependence on Tony.
Yeah, it's like she doesn't have that like network of female friendships to support her or offer a different perspective.
It's exactly. It reinforces that whole idea of women needing a man to complete them.
Now, contrast that with Veronica. She's got close female friends, a complicated relationship with her mother.
Right.
And she even, like, forms alliances with women who have been marginalized or victimized.
Her friendship with Wallace is so solid. And then her dynamic with Mac, the tech whiz,
Yeah.
it's like competitive, but also really supportive.
It shows the strength and complexity of female friendships, which is something we're seeing more and more of in, like, contemporary television.
Thankfully.
Yeah, it's like we're finally moving away from that tired trope of women always being catty and jealous of each other.
Right. And hopefully in real life, too.
Okay, so going back to what we were talking about earlier, about audiences interpreting shows differently. Imagine someone from the 1960s watching I Dream of Jeannie today versus someone watching it, back then.
Yeah, their reactions to Jeannie's subservience would be like worlds apart.
Totally. What might have seemed normal back then could be seen as like reinforcing these harmful stereotypes now.
Right. It highlights how important context is, when we're analyzing media.
And it brings up this idea of like a negotiated reading.
Yeah, viewers don't just passively accept the messages a show presents. They bring their own experiences and values to the table.
Right. So someone watching I Dream of Jeannie today might appreciate the humor and the nostalgia, but still recognize that some aspects haven't aged well.
Exactly. It's about having that critical lens.
And the same goes for Veronica Mars. Some viewers might focus on the mystery in action, while others might be drawn to the social commentary and like the complex female characters.
It's amazing how much depth there is to these shows when you start like digging beneath the surface.
Yeah, we could probably talk about this for hours, but we do have to move on.
Right.
So I'm kind of curious about the legacy of these shows. We've been analyzing them from this like academic perspective, but what about their cultural influence?
Yeah, good point.
Like I Dream of Jeannie was super popular back in the day. It ran for 5 seasons.
It really captured that blend of fantasy and humor that resonated with audiences.
Right. And even though Jeannie's subservience might seem problematic now, she still had this like charm and wit that made her relatable.
Yeah. And she wasn't just a passive figure. She had her own personality and even used her magic to challenge Tony sometimes.
Okay, now Veronica Mars, it didn't reach that same level of like mainstream success, but it's still considered groundbreaking for its portrayal of a strong, flawed, and independent female character.
Right. It really broke the mold and the writing was super sharp.
And those like dark humor moments.
Yeah, it definitely earned its cult following.
So both shows left their mark on television history, each reflecting the values and societal norms of their time.
Interesting, right?
It makes you wonder, like, What shows today will be analyzed decades from now?
Yeah, and what they'll say about our current culture.
Okay, so as we kind of wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
what's the most important takeaway you want listeners to, like, ponder as we head into the final part of our conversation?
I think the key takeaway is that the stories we tell and the characters we create have a real impact.
Sure.
They shape how we see the world and ourselves, and as viewers, it's on us to be critical consumers of media, to question what we're watching and demand more diverse and nuanced representations.
It's like a call to action, to keep pushing for more inclusive storytelling.
Yeah, exactly.
And to recognize that representation matters both on screen and behind the scenes.
This has been such an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I'm really glad you could join us for this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure, and I'm curious, what are you taking away from this whole thing?
That's a good question. It's interesting. We've been unpacking, like, a lot in this deep dive, exploring these two shows through a pretty academic lens. But what, like, really strikes me is how much these shows, in their own ways, contributed to the, like, evolution of how women are portrayed on TV.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see that progression.
Like, I Dream of Jeannie was very much a product of its time,
Right.
but it, like, paved the way for shows like Veronica Mars to kind of challenge those norms and, like, push those boundaries even further.
Yeah, and that evolution is something we see reflected in, like, the broader culture as well,
All right.
As ideas about gender roles shifted, so did the stories we told about women.
It makes you wonder, like, what will future generations think when they look back at the shows we're watching today?
I know, right? Like, what will they say about us?
I think that's a key takeaway for anyone listening. Like,
Yeah.
these shows aren't just entertainment.
Right.
They're like cultural artifacts that reflect the values and anxieties of their times.
Exactly.
And by examining them closely, we can gain a deeper understanding of, like, our own society and how far we've come.
It's like holding up a mirror to ourselves.
But through the lens of television,
It's
it makes you really think about the messages we're absorbing every time we watch a show or a movie.
Absolutely, and it highlights the importance of being, like, critical consumers of media.
Right.
To ask ourselves, like, whose stories are being told, whose perspectives are represented, and, like, whose voices are missing.
You're so right, because representation matters not just for women, but for everyone.
Absolutely.
Seeing yourself reflected in the stories you watch can be incredibly powerful.
Especially for those who have historically been marginalized or stereotyped.
It can be truly transformative, you know? It can inspire, empower, and even spark social change.
And on that note, it's encouraging to see, like, the progress that's been made in recent years.
Right.
With more diverse voices and perspectives finding their way onto our screens.
It feels like we're finally starting to move beyond those, like, tired tropes and stereotypes that have limited female characters for so long.
It's definitely a step in the right direction.
We're seeing more complex, multifaceted, and authentic portrayals of women.
Which is incredibly exciting.
It really is.
And I think it's important to, like, celebrate those wins while also continuing to push for more inclusive and representative storytelling.
Right.
Because there's always more work to be done.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's, like, the one thing you hope listeners will walk away with?
The power of representation.
Yeah.
The stories we tell have a profound impact on how we see the world and ourselves. And as viewers, we have a responsibility to be critical, to demand more, and to support those who are creating content that reflects the diverse tapestry of human experience.
It's about being mindful, asking questions, and using our voices to shape the media landscape we want to see. And who knows, maybe someday we'll be doing a deep dive into a show created by one of our listeners.
Oh, that would be amazing.
Featuring a groundbreaking female character who, like, shatters all the stereotypes. That's a future I'd love to see.
Me too. It's been such a pleasure exploring this topic with you.
It's been great having you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep watching, keep questioning, and keep those critical thinking caps on.